agreed upon. Let me move on to another type of model, which is extremely common in a number of ways in modeling a variety of things, and that's something called agent-based modeling. You can think of them sort of as computer games in some way. They represent different scenarios in a dynamic fashion that you can sort of play out. And let me just give you a couple of simple examples of that. But let me just first tell you where agent-based modeling comes from. And it comes again from John von Neumann. If you're ever going to read a biography of somebody, read a biography of John von Neumann. He was an amazing guy. So what he was looking at some point was to build a self-replicating robot. That was in the 1940s. And so that turned out to be rather challenging. So he was thinking of a self-replicating computational system. So one that has two properties. It can replicate itself in some suitably defined way. And it can simulate what's called a Turing machine. How many people know what a Turing machine is? Some do. Yeah. So it's essentially a machine that can compute anything in an appropriately formulated way. So that was what John von Neumann was thinking about. And his colleague at Los Alamos, Stanislav Ulam, invented these cellular automata to actually give an example of such a thing. And in the 60s, John Conway, a mathematician in Princeton, actually gave a very, very simple instantiation of a cellular automaton that can in fact self-replicate. And so let me explain John Conway's game of life to you, and then show you a more sophisticated instantiation of the cellular automata. So Conway's setup was the following. So you have a grid, a rectangular grid like this with grid squares. So this grid could be of finite size, or it could actually be of infinite size. If it's of finite size, you need to figure out what happens at the boundaries. And you think of this as sort of a collection of living organisms. Each of these squares represents a living organism. And you have a set of rules. And the rules are as follows. If you have a cell that has no or only one live neighbor, then it dies. So it sort of lives in a very sparse landscape where it cannot sustain itself. Right? If it has two live neighbors, it stays whatever it is. It's either dead or it's alive. And in this case, black is alive and white is dead. A cell with three neighbors lives, and a cell with four more live neighbors dies. It's too crowded. Okay? And so this system evolves in discrete time. Right? So here we have time 0, then it transitions to time 1 by applying these rules to each one of these squares. Okay? So let's do an example. Let's take this square here. Right? So how many neighbors does this square have? Well, I need to specify how I count neighbors. Right? So I count this as a neighbor, and I count this as a neighbor since they're connected by a diagonal. And this up there is a neighbor as well. So this square has 3 neighbors. So 3 neighbors, and it's alive, it'll just continue to live. This one here has 1 neighbor, it'll die the next one. So let's just practice, and let's look at this configuration. Right? What happens? What happens to this one? It dies. What happens to this one? And what happens to this one? What happens to this one? This one? This one? Stays the same. That's right. The configuration you get is this one. Now, if you play the same game again, you just get back what you had before. this dies, these come alive. And so you have sort of this linking situation. Now I was going to show you some videos from a website, but in the interest of time, let me not do that. Let me just tell you what the challenge is here. So if you now go on the web and you look for cellular automata, you find a bazillion pages. Okay? So there's a whole professional and amateur community out there with thousands and thousands of people that study cellular automata. Okay? And in particular, that study Conway's game of life. Right? So what's there to study? Okay? The fundamental question is the following. I have a grid like this. I start with an initial configuration. So I pick some cells live, some cells dead. And the question is, what happens if I start it up? Right? There are simple rules. Can I, from those simple rules, predict what's going to happen for a given configuration? And the answer is no. No way. No way can you predict for almost anything what's going to happen. So people spend a lot of time classifying different configurations. And so what I was going to show you is essentially a more complicated configuration that really comes alive and shows you sort of the equivalent of a whole society that does things and that sends off rockets into space that go and fly off and do various other things. So you can download simulators that will simulate this for you, and you can see whether for some configurations you can predict what happens. So for example, which configurations die out. Okay, so it might be that if you set this up, it'll just die. So here you have a population that is set up in a way that it cannot survive. Okay, so can you predict configurations that will die? This actually has many very interesting consequences. What this type of simulation is used for a lot is to simulate what happens in human populations. So for example, if you watch an animated movie with a big crowd scene, let's say thousands of animals running around, or thousands of soldiers running at each other, the way this is done today is not anymore by animation, where somebody draws a whole bunch of different scenes, but it is done by taking each one of these creatures in that crowd and equipping them with one of these cellular automata, not with deterministic rules, but with probabilistic rules. So it navigates its environment using one of these computational setups. And that's how these creatures run around in your animated movies. They are autonomous beings that have something like a cellular automaton that helps them compute what they do in relation to their neighbors and in relation to the terrain. So it's a very, very important kind of setup. And let me give you one example of a cellular automaton with a little bit of bells and whistles attached to it. This is something called SugarScape. So I first ran into this when my research group worked with the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. So that's an agency within the Department of Defense that is interested in precisely defense threat reduction. And so they had some problems they wanted us to help with, except only one person in our group had a security clearance. So what this person would do is get from folks at this agency the real problem, and when we translate it into a problem in the setting of a SugarScape simulation. And I'll tell you in a minute what this SugarScape simulation is. We would solve the problem, and then that person would translate that problem back to the real setup. So this is a grid what you see here are not the real grid points, but there's sort of a lot of very fine grid points, just like in the previous setting. And you have a bunch of agents running around, so-called agents. These are agent-based simulations. So they're individuals that run around, and this space is filled with sugar. So you think of sugar as a nutrient. Okay, and there's a nutrient gradient. So for example, here you find lots and lots of sugar, and in between you find somewhat less sugar. And these individuals run around, of course, following the sugar gradient. They have a metabolism that uses up sugar as they move. So if at some point they run out of sugar before they've found a source of sugar, they will die. Typically one imposes some additional tax on them that costs them sugar. And so you have an optimization problem. For example, you can study in detail how to best tax these individuals, how to impose a sugar tax or a real tax on a population if they move to optimize certain things. There are many, many different variations of sugarscape that can be used in a whole bunch of different settings, and it's all based on the fundamental concept of a cellular automaton, or the more general version of an agent-based simulation. So I pulled out just to show you that this is relevant in your world. So here's a tutorial, an announcement for a tutorial at the US Naval Academy on agent-based modeling and simulation. This is by a couple of people at Argonne National Laboratory, Michael North and Charles McCall. One of the things they have done with this sort of setup is, and they've become quite famous for it, they've built a virtual instantiation of Procter & Gamble. So you probably have heard of Procter & Gamble. They make, what do they make? Various chemical products, dishwashing detergents, I guess, things of that sort, all sorts of things like that. And they built an instantiation of Procter & Gamble's management structure and administrative infrastructure. And if the Procter & Gamble management wants to implement, let's say, a new bonus system, that people get bonuses for accomplishments, and they want to know whether that actually works and whether there are any unintended consequences, they will go to these guys and they will run simulations on this bonus system in their quite complicated model. And of course, that's what models in many ways are being used for, is to run simulations about certain ways of controlling things. So for example, my colleagues down at Virginia Tech in the Virginia Bioinformatics Institute, they have a project that's funded by Homeland Security. It's a very large simulation of the population of the entire United States, 350 million people, with a fairly accurate infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, housing infrastructure, and on top of that, you can simulate, for example, disease outbreaks. So you can ask questions like, we just got a terrorist threat that somebody released smallpox in the Chicago subway. Okay? So you would like to know if this is real or if this is a hoax. Okay? In principle, it doesn't matter, right? The consequences are almost as bad if it's a hoax, if you respond the way you ought to respond. Okay? So, but you might be able to know that this is a hoax by saying, well, if this happens on the A train that runs north-south in Chicago, and people get exposed to smallpox, where 2 days from then should I see people going to the hospital with what symptoms? Okay, because the people on that train, they will go to those particular suburbs, and they will get all sorts of problems. I can run a simulation. I can see, this is what I should see in those hospitals. If I actually see that, or if I don't, then that tells me something about how real that threat might be. So those are all things that you can run with agent-based models of this sort. And just for good measure, here's another one from the Army Research Laboratory on assessing consequential scenarios in a complex operational environment using agent-based simulation. So if you're interested in models, these are good models for your line of work. All right, and I was going to show you just a simulation. See if I can get to it. Well, never mind. Never mind. Let me, we have only 10 minutes left. So I was going to show you a simulation of a virtual patient that we've built to study the progression of an infection with Epstein-Barr virus, but I won't show you that. I want to instead move on to a project that we work on now that also uses precisely agent-based simulation to model, and that focuses on vascular injury. Okay, so I'm in a medical school. I work with the director of the Center for Vascular Biology. What she studies is the immune response to vascular injury. Okay, so vascular injury can be of several kinds, right? You could have a blood clot. Let's say you have a thrombosis in your leg, you have a heart attack, you have a stroke, or you have an injury to a limb which requires the interruption of blood flow to that limb. So sort of thing you might see on a battlefield. Now, what happens, so let's say you have your leg, you tie off blood flow to your leg. What happens in your leg? Well, it runs out of oxygen. The tissue runs out of oxygen. And as a result, there's some tissue damage. And the way this tissue damage happens is cells are dying because they don't have oxygen, but the other thing that happens is your cells create what's called reactive oxygen species. So these are chemicals that as the name says, they react with oxygen. And they form something called free radicals. And these free radicals are pretty nasty. They react with all sorts of things. They react with your DNA and damage it inside of a cell. They react with protein molecules and damage them inside of a cell. It's the essence of inflammation. So if you have inflammation somewhere, whether it's bug bite or something else, and your tissue gets all red, then one of the things that's responsible for that is the reactive oxygen species. Okay? So they form. And the longer the tissue is deprived of oxygen, the more of that forms. So now you get to a hospital, and blood flow to the tissue is restored. Then what happens? You have oxygen that rushes into the tissue, and all these reactive oxygen species that sit around find their oxygen, react, create all sorts of nasty things, that now create a whole bunch of secondary damage, which is at times worse than the original damage. Okay, so what you need to do to clear this is precisely what causes additional damage. And one of the big unsolved problems in treating these sorts of injuries is to find a way to mitigate this secondary damage. So that is what we're studying in this project. Um,